but I chuckle with the ones that die the final death. Obviously, like Reed Richards, gone. The Thing, gone. He doesn't seem to like it. Wolverine doesn't seem to like anybody in the Fantastic Four. Indie author, mostly in the horror genre. Kyle Doucette here. Recently, I did a video on how, as a child, my almost non existent interest in horror was piqued because of a comic book I read. That was a gateway into not only becoming a Batman fan because of the character Man Bat, but also the horror aspects. To this day, Man Bat remains one of my favorite villains slash DC characters, and I'm gonna have to check in to see what he's up to lately in comic book pages, digital or otherwise. Meanwhile, there's another important comic book in my reading history that was an introduction to certain characters as well as basically a guidebook. That is, what if Wolverine was Lord of the Vampires? Now, I was a kid in the 80s and a teenager in the 90s, so when this comic book came out in 1991, I didn't know a thing about the X-Men, and I had only a passing cultural understanding of vampires. As we all know, the fangs, they drink blood, they're allergic to, or daylight is deadly to them. But it just seems like everyone vaguely knows these things without almost like a cultural or a species memory. Now, vampires and vampire like creatures are things that I use in my own books, especially Larry's Cabin and the forthcoming They Feed at Night. And as I'm going through the editing process, getting it ready for a final draft, I realized that a lot of the vampire rules I decided to use came from this comic book. This was my introduction into the rules governing vampires or what their limits are. First thing, though, in my immature adolescent mind, this is where I was starting to figure out that, oh, Dracula is one of those characters that everybody can use. He's synonymous with the vampire or being a vampire. When the average person is asked about vampires, and well, maybe not so much in this day and age because of other movies, books, whatnot, but for a very long time, vampire meant Dracula. And Marvel uses him as an ongoing character, and he actually had quite a successful series published, The Tomb of Dracula. I think that's where Blade was introduced. From this specific comic book, though, I learned, and this is something I use for my own vampire-like creatures, is that they have extraordinary strength. Before reading this, I just thought a vampire was like a regular dude that could turn into a bat and drank blood at night. Oh, the cross thing, where Wolverine tries to defend himself, was aware of that as well. Use a religious symbol to try to protect themselves. Oh, and I think this is the comic book where I learned of the character of Nightcrawler, who became one of my favorite X-Men. The mind control aspect, or reading minds, was something I wasn't aware of before. And that is definitely something that I use for my particular kind of creatures. Back in 1991, I never thought about how somebody became a vampire. I just knew vampires drank blood, but this was the first mention I ever ran across of a body will lay dead for 3 days after a vampire drinks enough of the person's blood, and they will rise as a vampire. It's like, oh, that is something that I thought was really, really cool and creepy. There was also an inkling of a thought in the back of my mind of there's got to be some serious limits on what vampires can do. Otherwise, they would just run rampant and do whatever they wanted. I mean, it seems pretty easy to make new ones. Now, a regular person drinking vampiric blood and becoming a vampire, that's something I use that I don't think was mentioned in this comic book at all. Definitely one of the rules that I've integrated into my own universe. This comic book, or they do in the Marvel Universe with vampiric characters, is that there's one Lord of the Vampires who has a stronger will and can control the others. That's not something I do. The vampires that I use in my stories, they're pretty singular characters with their own talents and their own abilities. Basically, they're the same person that they were before becoming a vampire. Turning to mist or Changing into different kinds of animals, that's not something I ever used. There was definitely a man-bat-like creature in there, which I thought was pretty cool. And I wonder right now if they get to use that. I guess nobody can really have the copyright or reserve the right for a humanoid bat-like creature. Although in this comic it's pretty cool. Decapitation, just like in one of my favorite movies, Highlander. I guess it does the job all the time for any type of supernatural creature. Definitely did in this comic. So many characters. Well, it seems like almost the entire Marvel universe is in this one issue. One of the reasons I loved it, and I reread it so many times as a kid. Obviously, it's Peter Parker there with the Daily Bugle, and I love that they're just basically touching on it's hard to warn people, or it's hard to take this vampire plague or this vampire threat seriously because we can't take pictures of them. So people have to learn about this through word of mouth. That is something that I never even thought about using or incorporating into the stories that I've been writing about vampire-like creatures. Thank you, Nugget. It's something I never thought about using for the vampire-like creatures that I use in my stories. You can take pictures of them, you can take video of them, they take selfies, and they can see their own reflections in the mirror. I think this is the first comic I ever read with Doctor Strange as a character. I think this was my introduction to him. And of course, he's going to be the arch nemesis or the greatest threat to Wolverine as Lord of the Vampires because he's the Sorcerer Supreme. He's the guy that could wipe them all out with magic if he learns the proper spell. Something else they touch on in this issue is how they somehow find their way into people's homes. So they touch on the invitation rule there, which is something that I always found fascinating. And I think I knew about it before this comic book. It just seems that it's like integrated into the basic knowledge that people have of vampires is that you have to invite them in. So finding ways in can be pretty simple. You call somebody on the phone, you send them a text, or you have a welcome mat. But that is something that I've definitely used as one of the rules in the universe I've made. A vampire has to be invited in. And I do actually plan down the line in my series of books explaining where these rules, handicaps, limitations come from to keep vampires and other supernatural or unnatural beings under wraps. Yeah, a stake through the heart. That was also part of the original knowledge I had of vampires before reading this comic book. And the vampire-like creatures or the vampires I've made, no, a stake doesn't mean anything. Stake is just as good as any other weapon. So why did I pick this comic book up originally if I didn't know anything about the X-Men, Wolverine, and I only had like a passing interest or familiarity with vampires? The Punisher, he was on the cover. I was aware of that character at the time, and, you know, coming out of the 80s, I was definitely into the gun-toting, lots of bullets being fired, action-type movies. So I saw him loaded for bear, and I also saw the cross around his neck, and figured, you know, I like what-ifs, I like alternate timelines. This could be a good read. In the Punisher and Frank Castle in general waned after this, but I'm always going to remember this image. I think this is right up there with any kind of Superman pose, and it was an excellent initiation into the world of the X-Men and parts of the Marvel Universe I had never heard of or thought of before beyond Spider-Man. In this, a lot of information is packed economically into this comic with tons of characters. Basically with just a line or two there of everything you need to know about them before they do their thing or they're offed. Like, I had no idea who Magneto was, but I knew that he was important because Wolverine saw him as their initial threat before going after Doctor Strange. Now that I think about it, Professor Xavier wasn't mentioned at all in this comic book. Maybe he wasn't in continuity, or maybe he was off-world at the time in 1991. The part that made me laugh out loud, though, when I initially read this, and this still occasionally makes me chuckle, is the page where you get to see who Wolverine picks to let live and become a vampire. Or, I guess I should say, gets to be undead and return as a vampire. And, you know, he keeps Spider-Man around. He keeps the Kingpin around. Nick Fury, I guess they have a history together and they go back. But I chuckle with the ones that die the final death. Obviously, like Reed Richards, gone. The Thing, gone. He doesn't seem to like it. Wolverine doesn't seem to like anybody in the Fantastic Four. Hawkeye, dead. Daredevil, dead. Namor and Doctor Doom, gone. Not knowing a thing about Wolverine, just the fact that you can see who he prefers to keep around and who he sees as a threat gives a pretty good window into his reasoning and into his character. Yes, this comic is exciting from page one until the very end, and it is a absolute page turner. One of the reasons I love what ifs is you can actually have a body count in them. You can kill off characters, which I think is sorely needed in a lot of comic book storytelling. Like some of these characters should not have stuck around for as many years as they have. Like there's no sense of peril or threat. So that's one of the reasons why I like what If and why I like Elseworlds so much, and to a certain extent why I read certain comics like, say, The Walking Dead, or when that was running. I read that because you really didn't know who was going to live or die in that one. Definitely when I'm in the mood, I go back to the 80s and 90s and read some of these What If comics. I read some of the Elseworlds from the 90s in DC, their way of catching up with Marvel again. Some of them are just excellent and wonderful stories, basically because you know that no one has script protection in it. There it is, What If number 24, where I got the majority of my vampire knowledge before moving on to other movies, other comic books, other novels. But a lot of what I read as an 11 or 12-year-old in this, it really stuck. Definitely helped inspire me with coming up with my own version of vampires or vampire-like creatures in my own stories and novels. And not only do I have two full-length novels published, They Come Out at Night and Larry's Cabin, there's also a few free stories out there that are excellent little introductions into the world I'm creating with my series of books. They're for free on any ebook platform I could find. One is called Sleeper's Key, and the other is Escape. And I'm also planning on releasing a third free story before the release of my third novel, They Feed at Night. Thank you.